ancient civilizations were much smarter than many people realize. They used various different types of technologies to make their lives easier. Many of the technologies discovered by ancient people are still used even today. Join me for today's video as we take a look at 15 of the most incredible ancient technologies. Number 15. Greek fire. Fire on its own can be a scary natural event, but the medieval Greeks were able to harness the power of nature and take it to the next level with what is now known as Greek fire. What made this invention so frightening was that it was created using chemical compounds that prevent the fire from being extinguished. Couple that with the fact that the thick substance can stick to walls, flesh, and even burn on water, it made for a formidable and foreboding sight on the battlefield. More commonly, the Greek fire was put in glass jars and hurled at enemies, but it was also known to be used with a hose, allowing it to reach even further distances. A more famous instance when Greek fire was used against other humans was during the defense of Constantinople against the Arab fleet, setting their ships ablaze before ever making it to shore. The closest thing we'll ever have to Greek fire is napalm, and too many people have witnessed the devastation of the weapon firsthand. But the fact that something so effective at destruction was created so long ago is just a testament to the ingenuity of the ancient Greeks. Number 14. The nest of bees. Scared of bees? Well, then this next invention from medieval China may be one to steer clear of. And although there aren't any actual bees involved, the nest of bees still packs quite a nasty sting. Most likely invented in the 11th century, this was a long hexagonal tube filled with dozens of rocket-tipped arrows. The opening end of the tube was broad, allowing the rocket arrows to disperse once it opened. Invented shortly after gunpowder, this was one experiment you do not want to be on the receiving end of. Close to 30 arrows were shot at once across the battlefield, and if the impact or blood loss didn't kill the enemy, then the poison and flaming tips did. And because they were so small and simple, thousands could be deployed against an advancing enemy at once. Adding to the fear of being stung by one of the bees, they buzzed and howled as they flew through the air and left a thick trail of smoke in their wake. The nest of bees is as scary as it is cruel. Number 13. Antikythera mechanism. This mysterious deep-sea artifact was found by divers over a century ago in 1901 and had researchers, scientists, and archaeologists scratching their heads for another 100 years. 3 pieces of bronze that easily could have passed for moldy rocks had sat under the sea for about 2,000 years. When put together, though, they held a series of gears and rings divided into degrees. This is the Antikythera mechanism. And it turns out this mechanism is an analog computer used by the ancient Greeks. It took X-ray technology to solve the mystery. The mechanism was used at the time as a sophisticated calendar and computer that mapped the solar and lunar calendars and counted down the days to the Olympic Games. It's about the size of a mantle clock with knobs that are used to turn its hands with interlocking gear wheels, and even inscriptions on how to use it to read the moon and planetary phases. It's pretty amazing, even by today's standards. Number 12. Trebuchet. If you've ever played a real-time strategy game in a medieval setting, you'll be plenty familiar with this next entry on our list. I am, of course, talking about the trebuchet. It dates back as far as the 6th century and uses a long arm and counterweight to hurl objects thousands of feet. It may seem a little bit like child's play to modern society, but at the time it was created, it was the height of technology and mathematics. The trebuchet also changed warfare forever, acting as the siege weapon of choice until the advent of gunpowder, and it's easy to see why. When it comes time for battle, you can block an incoming sword with a shield or parry it with your own sword. You can even barricade the city's entry points to stop an oncoming battering ram. But when massive stones come hurtling at the walls, there's nothing you can do but pray. A group of trebuchets is a great way to chip at the enemy castle walls while your allies remain at a safe distance. Because this siege engine was so heavy, they were typically built right on site, but once it was set up, there was absolutely no defense against them. The best course of action for the defender is to fight on the ground they stand on in hopes of dismantling it, which also means charging straight into an enemy encampment. Good luck with that. Number 11. Plumbing. Indoor plumbing. Flushing your toilet is literally as simple as pushing a button. But you have to remember that wasn't always the case. When it came to civil engineering, the ancient Romans really knew what they were doing. And while places like China and Greece were coming up with new ways to set things on fire and shoot projectiles across the battlefield, Rome was thinking about something a lot more basic: plumbing. The Romans were able to create underground connected drainage pipes that were flushed on a regular basis and would run off from local streams. And while they may not have been sitting on something fancy like a Japanese porcelain toilet, the Romans were still certainly able to lighten their load and keep their otherwise grimy privies clean as a whistle. But the innovation didn't stop there. On top of personal flushing systems, the Romans also created everyone's favorite, the public restroom. These consisted of a simple covered gutter that people could do their business in while on the go. And while it may have been rudimentary, you have to remember that many of the streets in ancient cultures and societies were teeming with human waste for people to step over, or worse, step in. Number 10. Aqueducts. Flushing toilets and public restrooms weren't the only things Romans invented. Another incredibly ancient technology that we still use today is the aqueduct. The Romans were the first to successfully build the aqueducts that brought fresh water from smaller neighborhood sources and into the giant city centers. The days of hoofing it to the outskirts of the city to haul water back and forth quickly became a thing of the past. Earlier civilizations like Egypt managed to build similar structures, but the Romans perfected them. So while you don't need to reinvent the wheel, the ancient aqueduct was clearly in need of an upgrade. It was also an incredibly sustainable way to bring clean water to the thirsty masses because the Roman aqueducts relied on gravity alone. It all started with a large water holding area, and these structures would tunnel it all through to farms and fountains and, of course, the famous Roman bathhouses. The ramifications of the aqueduct were incredibly overwhelming, and who knows where Rome and the rest of the world would be without it. And remember, all of this was done around the year 300 BCE. Number 9. Viking compass. Vikings are having a bit of a resurgence these days, with video games, movies, and plenty of television shows all depicting shirtless, loincloth-clad, axe-wielding men conquering new lands and eating giant turkey legs. But they were much more than just that. Historians, engineers, and craftspeople around the world are still baffled by the Viking longships because they traveled so far and fast, and we have yet to figure out just how such an ancient culture did it. But you can't ride around in a boat without a navigator, and while many seafarers relied on the stars to find their way, these Nordic folk used their Viking compass. Known to the Vikings as the Vigvisir, this compass-like sigil is made of 8 ancient Viking rune staves, which were the symbols of divine protection that they believe could also be used as a compass. It's likely that these rune staves also corresponded to what's called the cardinal and intercardinal directions, meaning north, south, east, and west, and every combination in between. A nail was placed in the center of the Vigvisir, and the shadows cast would reveal directions. And while that may sound like a simple Boy Scout compass, the Vigvisir has the same accuracy as a modern-day GPS, so just let that sink in for a moment. Vikings used larger sunstones to navigate the waters, and their Vigvisir is the smaller, more personalized version. Number 8. Roman concrete. If you've ever been to Rome, it is fair to ask how all of the old structures are still standing strong. The quick answer is Roman concrete. For starters, Roman concrete contained volcanic rock and lime, and when those two ingredients are mixed with seawater they use to create concrete and bricks, you get an incredibly strong bond. We drive around on these roads and wonder if they're going to fix it, and ask why these newly paved roads deteriorate so quickly. The closest thing we have to something like Roman concrete is called Portland cement, which only lasts for about 50 years. But if this Portland cement is exposed to seawater, then you can cut that number back substantially. And not only does the Roman concrete last for centuries, but the Roman method is also far more environmentally friendly and sustainable, because not only does it last for what feels like forever, it releases a lot less carbon dioxide into the air annually. It's amazing how so many companies are scrambling and racing to give us the next big eco-friendly invention, when one of the greatest solutions to our climate crisis is staring us right in the face. What the hell are we waiting for? Number 7. Hufeng didong. If you've ever been in an earthquake, you'll know just how scary it can be. The unnatural movement of the earth coupled with everything falling down around you and the uncertainty of the structure you're in is enough to take years off your life. Luckily, many cities have measures in place to give people a fair warning so they can get somewhere safe. But in the grand scheme, something like a seismograph or warning system is a new invention, right? Nope. Ancient China was way ahead of us when they created the mechanism known as the Hufeng didong. This goes back a good 2,000 years and is the first earthquake detection device in recorded history. And despite its age, it was incredibly effective. So while the technology we're used to may be a bit more complex, the Hufeng didong had a very simple design. It was a basic jar filled with 8 tubed projections, all of which were shaped like dragon heads for aesthetic purposes, and 8 toad-like features that were at the base, each representing a direction of the seismic waves. And if you wanted to know just where the earthquake was coming from, all you had to do was place a ball in the top of the jar and it would fall to the corresponding toad. Like I said, simple yet effective. The Hufeng didong was created by Zhang Heng, who is known as the Leonardo da Vinci of China because of his often unsung contributions as an inventor, astronomer, scientist, scholar, artist, and engineer. Number 6. Rust-proof iron. Looking at the rusted metal on what was once a beautiful structure can be pretty gross. Wouldn't it be nice if we could create some sort of rust-proof alloy to prevent that level of corrosion? Well, if you travel to Delhi in India, you can find exactly that. There is one single iron pillar that never seems to rust despite time and weather. And it's not because it's brand new either. The Iron Pillar of India dates back to the reign of King Chandra, which means that it was built around the year 327 BCE. That's almost 2,000 years old. And stainless steel wasn't even a thing until the year 1913. So how the hell were these ancient people able to create such a long-lasting alloy? It took scientists a bit of time to come up with the answer, but it turns out that the engineers and welders of the day had developed a 3-phase process that created a thin protective layer over the pillar, which was oxidized to protect the iron pillar from rusting essentially forever. And it's a good thing, because ancient writing was engraved into the iron underneath that can still be read to this day. The rust-proof iron pillar stands about 24 feet tall with a 16-inch diameter and weighs over 6,500 pounds. And its original purpose remains a bit of a mystery. But what else remains a mystery is the methods they used to preserve it. I suppose the answers died with them long, long ago. Number 5. Baghdad Battery. Batteries, they go into just about everything, from remote controls to hair dryers and now even our cars. But the folks of ancient Baghdad had the idea long before any of these inventions, with a piece of technology known as the Baghdad Battery. But this doesn't look like your typical AA battery. Instead, the Baghdad Battery is a piece of copper, an iron rod, and a ceramic pot. This battery was discovered in Iraq, and it was dated back to sometime between 150 BCE and 650 AD. And yeah, that's a pretty big 700-year gap, but there's also no denying that it's one old piece of technology. And despite the name, no one really knows for sure what the Baghdad Battery does, but there are plenty of theories that abound. The most popular of these is that the ancient battery was used for either electroplating or more nefarious electrotherapy. But work is still being done on this odd find, and the corrosion on the metal could imply that it contained an acidic electrolyte solution that would have created electricity. But then again, there's also the theory that this was just a fancy clay pot that held scrolls. But the thing is about the Baghdad Battery is even if it was just a happy accident that holds scrolls, they weren't very far off from generating electricity. Number 4. The Egyptian Pyramids. The Great Pyramids of Giza is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it's been the subject of debate for years. They were built 4,500 years ago, but the thought of constructing something so monumental so long ago is what keeps people up at night. At the time, the ancient Egyptians only had rudimentary copper tools to aid their infrastructure. They didn't have machinery like cranes and hadn't even had the wheel yet. So assuming that the pyramids of Giza were built using nothing but strength of men, then it would have taken 20 years to build each one. And while that may sound feasible, things tend to get a little stranger the deeper you dig. The size of the pyramids is impressive in their own right, but they were built with such precision that it's hard to believe that an ancient civilization is behind it all. First of all, the pyramids are all oriented within 1/15 of a degree to north, south, east, and west, despite the Egyptians' lack of astronomy. But these ancient wonders are the most accurately aligned structures in existence, even more so than most modern buildings. And that's where the fun really starts. How is something like this even remotely possible? What did the ancient Egyptians have that we don't? The pyramids of Giza are also located right in the center of the Earth's landmass, meaning the east-west parallel and the north-south meridians all intersect perfectly. The whole thing is enough to make chills run down your spine. Even the radius of the sun is related to the perimeter, and its weight is also relative to the Earth's mass. The entire solution is one technological mystery that will probably never be solved, but it's easy to see why so many people think that the ancient Egyptians had a little help other than slave labor along the way. Number 3. Crossbow. Taking the idea of the bow and arrow and giving it an upgrade is the crossbow. And while this crossbow consists of a short bow and a much smaller bolt, meaning it has less range, approaching a wall of crossbowmen is not something you want to do. That bolt is flying straight and fast enough to pierce armor, and they were essentially the guns of the Middle Ages with a range of about 1,000 feet. And while the English longbows were a force to be reckoned with in their own right, you still need an extensive training regimen to actually become a lethal archer. Anybody and everybody could wield the wicked crossbow. It required very little skill, but was just as deadly. Even after firearms were introduced, the crossbow still reigned supreme as the handheld ranged weapon of choice because of its superior accuracy. At the time, the crossbow was slightly easier to reload than a musket, was smaller, and the ammunition wasn't as bulky, so you could have plenty of bolts on you at any given time. The fact that you can still buy a crossbow at a hunting store today is testament to their staying power. Number 2. Damascus steel. Conan the Barbarian spent much of his life trying to solve the riddle of steel, but it looks like he needn't look further than ancient Damascus. During medieval times, people were seeing some ridiculously strong swords coming out of the Syrian capital of Damascus that were tough enough to never chip and even tougher to pierce through armor. Damascus steel is made from a raw material known as wootz steel, which could only be found in parts of Asia at the time, and no one was ever able to recreate its strength and durability until the Industrial Revolution. And while the steel was being produced from 300 BCE up until the 18th century, the knowledge of the process seems to have vanished entirely. But thank God for nanotechnology. It took centuries to finally solve the riddle of Damascus steel when scientists were finally able to scan it under an electron microscope in their modern-day labs. The big hypothesis going states that the wootz steel of Asia combined with the materials local to Damascus during the production process made for the real-world equivalent of Valerian steel. The process works all the way down to the molecular level, creating ultra-hard carbon nanotubes. And by the 18th century, the chemical makeup of those raw materials had changed, and the molecular qualities of those minerals were gone for good. Number 1. Heat rays. Militaries around the world are developing all sorts of intricate technologies focused on lasers. And while we may never see the phasers of Star Trek, Archimedes came pretty damn close in the 3rd century BCE. The famous Greek mathematician developed what is essentially a heat ray weapon, so perplexing that not even the brains over at Mythbusters could figure out how he did it. Archimedes' heat ray was likely made of a polished bronze that simply reflected the rays of the sun at enemy ships. And while that may sound a little silly, some well-placed concentrated heat could easily cause some combustion on board. It's incredibly simplistic, but the thing about the heat ray is, you may run out of arrows, and swords can chip and shatter, but as long as the sun is out, you've got a nasty weapon. And although it's more than 2,000 years old, Archimedes' heat ray has some serious staying power, because as recently as 2001, DARPA revealed they're working on a weapon that uses microwaves to burn and penetrate the victim's skin, reaching temperatures of about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And while it won't actually light the person on fire, it's gonna feel like you've stepped foot into an inferno. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.